Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Steve McConnell, and I'm very happy to be here at the Software Effectiveness Conference, ready to talk about secrets of world-class software organizations. So I thought an interesting way to start on this would be to say, well, how would you interpret world-class, and how would you view world-class? Well, if you're somebody like Capers Jones, you're probably saying world-class is something like you've achieved a certain level of quality and you're winning Baldrige Awards and things like that. If you are the late, great Watts Humphrey, maybe you're saying that a world-class software organization is one that is using PSP and TSP and making disciplined use of those practices and achieving super high quality levels. If you are these guys, the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, you might be saying a world-class software organization is one that is incredibly responsive to change and does everything just in time and has very little waste and very little work in progress. My definition is a little bit different. And to give you an idea of where I come from, I would ask a couple of questions. One is, can you have a world-class software organization inside a mediocre business? And the corollary question is, well, can you have a mediocre software organization inside a world-class business if the primary purpose of that world-class business is actually software? And I actually have, I believe, a pretty strong answer to those questions. I think that if the business is truly a mediocre business, then I would really question whether the software organization is truly world-class or not. Whether if it was world-class, would it be supporting something better than a mediocre business? And each year in the fall, I've run this Software Leadership Summit or Software Executive Summit. In the first year of the summit, we had a speaker that said, that described a project and described how the project went, and the project had been delivered on time and had functionality that someone thought was desirable. And one of the people in the audience raised their hand and said, "Hey, well, how did the product do in the marketplace?" And the speaker said, "Well, it was one of those cases where it was really kind of a technical success, but a business failure." And practically everyone in the room, all these executives, almost rose out of their seats in unison and said, "No, it's not possible. If something is a technical success and a business failure, it wasn't really a technical success because it didn't meaningfully read the needs of the business or support the business." And so my view of world-class definitely says that the software organization is supporting a world-class business. And I think if the software organization is supporting a world-class business, then that is a pretty strong clue that the software organization is itself world-class because it's doing what it needs to do to support the needs of the business. So in my view, software development success certainly consists of delivering software that's on time, on budget, with desired functionality at a defined level of quality and in a sustainable way. Certainly all of those factors matter. And so my definition, just to put a ribbon on the package, is that a world-class software organization is one that is effective enough to support the business success of a world-class business. And so we're kind of coming at this from really from the business point of view. If the business is world-class, then what is the software organization doing inside that business to support that? So what I'd like to do in this talk is go through a selection of world-class software organizations and then try to draw some commonalities or themes that we'll see between these different software organizations. And these come from a variety of sources. My company, Construx Software, works with dozens of companies each year on a consulting basis. We work with hundreds of companies each year on a training basis, and we actually get to see more than you might think when we get involved in a training capacity. Training always ends up being at least a little bit of consulting, and so we learn lots and lots about the companies we work with on a training basis. We also host events each year, including our Leadership Summit. We're active in industry organizations like IEEE and so on. And then we do other research. We, from time to time, will do surveys. We participate in discussion focus groups. And of course, we read other companies' research as well. So pulling all that together brings me to the examples that I've come up with for world-class software organizations. We have worked with companies across a lot of different industries. And so when I talk about world-class, I'm really talking about world-class across a lot of variety. We worked with companies in entertainment and media on one end of the spectrum, to heavy equipment on the other end of the spectrum, to safety critical medical devices on another part of the spectrum, to financial and telecom and government retail. So we really cover a lot of different industries. Now, out of all these industries, what companies can we talk about? The answer really is, in specific terms, basically none of them. Of course, the work we do is covered under confidentiality agreements. Even if the work wasn't covered under confidentiality agreements, I wouldn't really feel comfortable sharing details that we had learned about companies by engaging with them for consulting or training purposes. So this talk really is informed by what we have learned in those more private confidential engagements. But the details I'm going to be talking about are details that are publicly available details. So really the experience we have is served to filter that information and form the basis of selecting which companies I talk about today. So let's turn then to a sample of world-class software organizations. And the first organization that I would like to talk about is Microsoft. And this is not Microsoft today, this is Microsoft circa 1990. So back when Microsoft really was the hottest software company on the planet. Not really true today, although it seems like it's making a resurgence recently. But certainly in 1990, there was no question that Microsoft was far and away the hottest software company on the planet. One attribute that Microsoft had at that time was the hiring was incredibly selective. At the time, the ratio of people who applied for each job was about 100 to 1, so 100 applicants for each open job, which allowed Microsoft to be incredibly selective in its hiring practices. One attribute that I thought was really interesting about Microsoft when I was there was that the technical discussions were incredibly unvarnished, bare-knuckled, candid, knockdown, drag-out. I remember being in meetings where there would be two guys who'd be having an argument, be like 11:30 in the morning. They'd be having this knockdown, drag-out argument about some technical detail. And then somebody would look at the clock and say, oh, it's time for lunch. And they would just stop. And they'd say, oh, well, do you want to go to building 8 or do you want to go to building 13? And they say, oh, we went to building 8 yesterday. Let's go to building 13. And these two guys who seemed like they were about ready to kill each other 30 seconds ago just wander off happily and go to lunch. And this was kind of an adjustment for me. I didn't really understand exactly what was going on in these interactions, but what I learned was that at Microsoft, the culture at the time simply did not put any value whatsoever on social niceties or politeness or being kind or courteous. It really was just cut to the meat of the technical issue and discuss it in an unvarnished way. And I can't say I ever grew to like that mode of interaction, but I can certainly say that I grew to appreciate how efficient those discussions were. You could cover a lot of ground in a hurry with that mode of discussion. And so I think that was definitely an overall a positive contributor. I never, when I founded my own company, didn't try to copy the bare-knuckled kind of rude part of the behavior, but I definitely tried to copy the cut to the chase and let's just make sure we spend most of our time focusing on substantive issues part of it. Microsoft, of course, was highly process-oriented and had really rigorously defined processes. No, of course not. I'm joking. Microsoft was not very rigorously at the time. It was definitely a cowboy culture, very much the ethos of the individual hero programmer at that time. And I think that's important to understand. I mean, they were very, very successful. The business was incredibly successful. And the underlying technical practices were pretty much focused on really high-performing individuals, not so much on having a really high level of defined processes or statistical process control or anything like that. And I'll return to that comment in a moment, but I think for those people who tend to be a little bit more process-oriented, I think it's important to understand this was a super successful company that really wasn't benefiting from or focusing at all on those kinds of defined processes. And then there was this phrase at Microsoft that had, at the time, that had this almost magical power, the phrase, do the right thing. And how that worked was you'd be in a meeting and people would be talking about different technical approaches to something. And one of the technical approaches might be quicker or, be glitzy or something, but the other technical approach would be more sound, would be more scalable, it would be, more bulletproof, higher quality. And at some point in the meeting, somebody would say, hey guys, we've got to do the right thing here. And what that meant was we've got to do the thing that supports the highest level of quality, highest level of reliability. And that phrase at the time at Microsoft had the power to make people kind of sit back in their seats and say, okay, yeah, we were focusing on some other stuff that really isn't the most important stuff. We really do have to do the right thing and focus on highest possible quality. So there was definitely a quality focus in play, a strong quality focus at the time. I thought this comment from Chris Peters was interesting. Chris Peters at the time was high-flying, high-profile senior VP at Microsoft. He had been very successful in leading Excel 3.0, which at the time that was completed was regarded as the most successful project in the history of the company. And Chris Peters gave this talk called, what was it, Shipping World-Class Software on Time. And he went around the company and gave this talk, and it was a really popular talk, and it got put on videotape, and the video was played many, many times around the company. And so there was a deliberate attempt, I think, to spread the culture of that project across the company. And he made this comment that the goal is not to write code. If we could ship products and make all this money without writing any code, we would. Your job is to ship products exactly on time. It doesn't matter whether you're a developer, tester, program manager, product manager, whatever. Everybody's job is the same. And so there was this really intense focus on getting product done. And Chris Peters' comment and the related video and talk, I think, we're very much focused on creating this culture of our job is to ship software. It's not to write software. It's not to come up with cool stuff that never sees the light of day. It is to actually ship software. And as time went by, this cultural idea was actually institutionalized at Microsoft pretty significantly. A few years after the Excel 3.0 project, Microsoft started giving out these Ship It Awards. And the Ship It Awards are these really thick, heavy Lucite awards that you would get when you actually shipped software. And people would put these on their shelves. Of course, we're in a little bit of an earthquake zone here in the Seattle area, so I always wondered about the wisdom of having these super heavy monolithic objects sitting on high shelves that could fall over on people's heads. But people accumulated quite a few of these over the years, and it was quite a badge of honor to have multiple Ship It Awards displayed on your shelf. And I think Microsoft succeeded in developing this cultural focus on actually shipping software. And I think that was really a counterpoint to what had been true at Microsoft in the very early days, where there was maybe more of a research focus, but not so much of a shipping focus. And so they took some steps to actually make a focus on getting software into the hands of the users, and that actually worked quite well. Now, before I had worked at Microsoft, I'd worked at a company that was a very traditional, kind of old-fashioned bureaucratic company, and they were so bureaucratic that if, for example, I needed a pad of Post-it notes, I would have to go to a different floor. I would have to go up a couple floors from the floor I was working on, and I would have to get the Post-it notes on a different floor. And not only did I have to go up a couple floors, I also had to talk to the person who was sitting literally inside a cage, where the office supplies were all inside the cage, and I had to tell them I would like some Post-it notes. And at that point, they would say, okay, do you have the job code for the job you're working on so I know who to charge them to? At that point, I would say, no, I don't. And I'd have to go back down a couple floors, ask my boss what the job code was, and I'd go back up a couple floors, give it to the person sitting behind the cage, at which point they would give me a pad of Post-it notes, and I could go back down and use my Post-it notes. So getting a pad of Post-it notes was like a, 5 to 10 minute operation full of bureaucracy, really pretty unbelievable. When I went to Microsoft, I was pleasantly surprised to find that they just had these supply rooms, and they had Post-it notes and high density tapes and pens and paper clips and anything else I could possibly imagine. Removable disk drives. I mean, pretty much anything you wanted was in the supply room. There was no one there. There was nothing to sign out. You just took this stuff. If you needed it, you took it. And at the time, my wife had been trying to get a whiteboard at her company, and they were very slow in providing a whiteboard. So she went to Office Depot and spent $25 or whatever, took in her own whiteboard, put it in her office, at which point her company got mad at her for buying her own whiteboard, saying, if you have a whiteboard, everyone else is going to want a whiteboard. And so they actually made her take her whiteboard away. Now, in contrast, at Microsoft, if you needed a whiteboard, you would send an email to facilities and say, I need a whiteboard. And they would send you an email back saying, okay, put a Post-it note on the wall where you want the whiteboard installed. It was very easy to get the Post-it note because you just walk down the hall to grab your Post-its. You put the Post-it note on the wall, and the next morning you'd come in, and there would be a whiteboard mounted on your wall where the Post-it note was. It all worked very, very seamlessly and easily. Similarly, in other companies I had worked at up to that time, maintaining the computer was actually the personal responsibility of the developer, and so you could have a lot of downtime when your computer was down. But at Microsoft, they put such an emphasis on keeping the developers working that if something happened to your computer, you would send a note on your email or somebody else's email account if you couldn't use your own and say, hey, my computer's down. And within 20 minutes, maybe somebody from IT would show up and they would have a cart, and they would typically they would know what your computer was, and they would typically just take the hard drive out of your computer, stick it into an identical other computer that they knew was working, and you'd be up and running, half an hour after you sent the note, and you'd never see your old computer again because it didn't matter. They had just given you a new machine, and the focus was just on keeping the people who were doing the development actually working. And this all seemed to work really, really well. The culture at Microsoft was very much one of work hard, play hard. And I think sometimes people confuse this by saying that, oh, if we want to have a really intense high growth company, we're going to make people work hard. It's not really how it worked at Microsoft. At Microsoft back then, people wanted to be there. I remember one Friday night, I was at my desk at about 5 o'clock, and a bunch of people came by and said, hey, we're going to a movie. Do you want to go? And I said, sure. So we went out, we had dinner, we went to a movie, and the movie ended about 10 or 10:30, at which time everybody said, hey, it's 10 or 10:30. We're not tired yet. We'll go back to work. And so 10:30 on a Friday night, everybody goes back to work and keeps working, because what else would you do? You're still awake. You're going to keep working. I had a friend at Microsoft who was Christmas Day, which in the US is a popular holiday, the most popular probably. And her mother tried to get in contact with her on Christmas Day. So she called her at her apartment. She wasn't there. She called her at her boyfriend's house. She wasn't there. She called her at her desk at Microsoft. And of course, that's where she was, because where else would you be other than at your desk at Microsoft on Christmas Day? That's what you're doing. You're awake. You're going to be working. And I think there was also an incredible level of support for technical staff. There was a story that was in pretty widespread circulation that I heard from multiple people that went like this. It said there was a technical person who really thought the product direction should go a particular way, and there was a VP of sales and marketing who really thought the product direction should go a different way. And the two of them argued, and they couldn't get it resolved. And the effect was that the VP of software was, or rather the VP of sales and marketing was fired, and the software person got their way, and the product went on and was successful. The thing that was interesting to me about this story was I never heard what product it was attached to. I never heard the name of the specific technical person. I never heard the name of the specific VP of sales and marketing. After a while, I became convinced that the story actually was made up, that it hadn't actually occurred. But what I think was going on was there was a deliberate attempt by senior leadership at Microsoft to enculturate the idea that if you're a technical person, you should really fight for what you believe in. And if you're just a senior developer and you're arguing with a VP of sales and marketing, it's okay to argue with that person, because we really want the technical staff to be arguing for their convictions. And so I think there was some deliberate kind of cultural engineering occurring that was reflected in that story. And then there's a really interesting story about a project where way back when Microsoft was working on this operating system called OS/2. And at the time, Steve Ballmer was the head of the division. He wasn't the CEO yet. He was the head of the division. And the OS/2 team was having trouble shipping on time. So Ballmer had a meeting with the development team and said, what would you guys like? What's it going to take? Do I need to offer you big bonuses? Do I need to offer you a trip to Hawaii? Do you need more support staff? What's it going to take to ship this software on time? And the dev team came back to him and said, we don't need bonuses. We don't need a trip to Hawaii. We don't need support staff. What we really would appreciate is if we could get a washer and dryer installed in the building, then we wouldn't have to go home to do our laundry. We could just stay here and work more. And I have to say, when you get to the point where your development team is only asking for a washer and dryer so that they can stay at work longer, then you really know you've achieved an extraordinary level of buy-in to what you're doing, and an extraordinary level of commitment to the project that your company is working on. And I think Microsoft had that at that time. Google then, I think, is a second example of a world-class software organization. And in a lot of ways, I see Google as Microsoft 2.0. I think it really looked to me like Google had studied Microsoft and had attempted to replicate it and improve it all at the same time. So Google has a lot of the same kinds of amenities that Microsoft had. It has on-site concierge service so that you can drop off your dry cleaning. It has on-site oil changes, so you don't have to leave to go get your oil change. It has on-site car washes, so you don't even have to leave campus to get your car washed. You can get your hair cut on-site. Of course, everybody knows about the fact that they've got world-class chefs that are cooking meals. You can have 3 meals a day on Google campuses. And you have Google buses. Microsoft has those now too, but I think Google started it so that you could ride in your bus, you could get Wi-Fi on the bus, you could work during time that you normally would just be driving. So I think there's been a lot of ways in which Google has studied the Microsoft experience and taken it a couple steps further. I think like Microsoft in 1990-ish timeframe, Google's incredibly selective. They have many, many applicants for each open position, which allows them to be very selective in their hiring. Like Microsoft, I don't think Google has any really strong emphasis on formal development practices. Certainly they have some tacit practices and so on, but I think it's only been in the last few years that Google has finally started to see a little bit more formality in their approaches to software development. And we'll come back to that comment in a little bit. And then I think it's interesting, they put quite a focus on innovation with the think time idea for many years, got a lot of publicity on that. And then explicitly about 2 years ago, I think that was actually taken away. The interesting thing to me is that the people we talked to at Google said it didn't really ever exist in practice, that although they talked about it, that there was pressure on the individual teams not to actually use your 20% think time because it meant that you weren't actually contributing to your team. So it wasn't so much that the leadership was saying don't use it. It was more like you're going to let down your team if you actually use it. So what we heard was that in practice, it really wasn't used that much anyway. So I think this comment from Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google at the time he made this comment, was pretty interesting and reflects that Microsoft 2.0 idea, where he says the goal is to strip away everything that gets in our employees' way. We provide a standard package of fringe benefits, but on top of that are first-class dining facilities, gyms, laundry rooms, massage rooms, haircuts, car washes, dry cleaning, commuting buses, just about anything a hardworking employee might want. And then I think quite interesting in light of the OS2 story at Microsoft, let's face it, programmers want to program. They don't want to do their laundry. So I think Google's a pretty interesting example. I'm not going to dwell on Google at length just because in the last few years there's been so much publicity about Google. You can probably fill in a lot of those details yourself. So let's talk a little bit, take a step away from talking about specific companies and take a view on what factors really matter in terms of being effective software development organization. And I like to look at software dynamics through the lens of the Kokomo 2 estimation model. As I've said before, I'm not a super big fan of Kokomo 2 as an estimation model per se, but I am a big fan of Kokomo 2 as a really rigorous isolation of how much individual factors affect software project outcomes. So the chart that I've shown here shows the Kokomo 2 effort multipliers and scaling factors for a large size development initiative, 5 million lines of code. And for those of you who attended my talk yesterday, I talked about the fact that the scaling factors are the factors that affect outcomes in a non-linear way. So the bigger the project gets, the higher impact proportionally those factors have. And so the scaling factors in this chart are shown in the yellow bars, and that's process maturity, architecture and risk resolution, team cohesion, development flexibility, and precedentedness. And as you can see, for a large size project, each of the scaling factors is in the top half in terms of influence on software project outcomes. Now, if I look at a small project, in this case, 100,000 lines of code rather than 5 million lines of code, the scaling factors are still shown in yellow. It's still the same factors. But now, because they have a non-linear impact on project outcomes, depending on the size of the project, at the smaller size project, all 5 of these factors are in the bottom half in terms of influence on software project outcomes. And I think this is pretty interesting. I commented earlier that Microsoft had circa 1990 very much a cowboy culture, not much of a focus on process. And Google for many years, I think, was very much the same. You look at this chart and you say, well, process maturity, it's not even in the top half of factors for projects at the 100,000 line of code level. If I go start to become a bigger project at the 5 million line of code level, well, now it matters a lot. It's factor number 3 out of the entire list of factors. But at small project size, it really isn't that much of a factor. What is a factor are things like product complexity, which I can't really do anything about. It's dictated to me by the nature of the industry I'm in. But analyst capability refers to how good are the people working on the requirements. Programmer capability is how good are the programmers. Personnel continuity is what's my turnover level. Multi-site development has to do with how many different sites I'm at. Microsoft in 1990 was incredibly selective in their hiring. They had fantastic people working on requirements. They had fantastic programmers. They had incredibly low turnover. And they were trying to conduct all the development not only in one site, but typically in one corridor of one building. So if you look at the factors that matter at small project sizes, Microsoft was pretty much pegging the needle and doing the best it possibly could for the factors that mattered at that size. Now, as you get to larger size, there are some changes that have to be made. And so whereas something like process maturity didn't matter at small size, at larger size, it starts to matter a lot. And so this is one of the transitions we see companies struggle with as they move from smaller projects to larger. They keep trying to use the same practices that made them successful when they were smaller, and they just don't work as well when they're larger. So that can be a difficult transition for companies. But I think what it also says is that success of early to mid-stage Microsoft, early to mid-stage Google, focusing on people but not so much on process, it's actually not a bad decision. There are reasons that we can understand why those companies were successful, even though some people are more process-oriented might think, well, gee, they should be less sloppy in their practices. Well, maybe they should, but they actually are optimizing for the things that really matter by hiring super selectively, making sure that people stay through those lavish benefits packages and so on. I think another interesting viewpoint that we get through the Kokomo model is a viewpoint on where are the levers we can pull to actually improve our software projects. And in this chart, I've color-coded the different factors based on those that are generally within the control of a particular project. So one project leader or project team can significantly, in fact, impact this factor. Those are shown in blue. As you can see, there aren't very many of those, and they don't matter very much. So we've got documentation as a factor is actually the biggest one. And then for smaller projects, architecture and risk resolution, and whether we're going to try to reuse the stuff we develop, those are really the only things that are really under the control of the project. The red factors are those that really are largely uncontrollable. Those are the ones that essentially are dictated to you by the nature of the kind of business you've decided to have. If I'm going to work on real-time embedded software, I'm going to have a high degree of product complexity, and I don't really get to not have that unless I decide to get into a different line of business. So I would say that's largely uncontrollable. And then the orange factors are the factors that really are largely within the organization's control. And so that includes things like the analyst capability or skill of the people who are doing the requirements, programmer capability, and so on. And I think why this matters is that a lot of times when organizations say, we need to improve our software development efforts, they push responsibility for that down to the level of the individual project leader or project manager. And what this chart says is that strategy is not going to work very well because the levers that the individual project manager has are actually pretty minimal, whereas the levers that really matter are really at the organizational level. And so improvement of the software organization, or if you want to go back to the focus of the talk, creation of a world-class software organization is really going to be something that has to be done mainly at the organizational level. Project managers certainly can influence some of the details, but the really big levers are levers that the organization is going to need to focus on. Another, I think, perspective on this idea of process is, and I focus a little bit on process because it's been an interest of mine for a long time, and a lot of people who try to improve software practices do focus on process, whether we're talking about process of Scrum or Kanban or Six Sigma or Lean in general. I was talking with a senior leader, a guy who I really respected, and we were talking about, well, what makes a difference in project outcomes? And he said, well, it's all about the processes that the individuals use, isn't it? I mean, somebody who's really good is going to use good process, and somebody who isn't that effective just uses worse process. They're just not as conscientious about the process they use. That's really what it's all about, isn't it? And the comment kind of set me back because I really respected this guy, but I completely disagree with the comment. I don't think it's all about process at all. I think process matters, but I think it's about how the interactions occur between people. Do people interact in a friendly way? Do they help each other? That's not really process. I think it's more about attitude. Do people raise their hand and ask for help when they need help? That's not really process. I think that's about attitude as well. And how energetic are people? How focused are they? I think that the highly focused application of a high level of personal energy matters at least as much as process does, probably quite a bit more. Highly focused application of personal energy makes up for a lot of sins in the process area. So, no, I don't agree that it's all about process. I think there are other factors that matter. And if we really study and take to heart the success of high growth early to mid stage companies, whether it's Microsoft or Google or Facebook or Netflix, I think the commonality we see is high focused personal energy, and process really isn't that much in the mix. So let's return to our sample of world-class software organizations. The next organization I'd like to focus on is a less high-profile company, unless you're in this industry. It's called Epic Software, and they make software for hospitals and medical groups and so on. Epic was founded by a female computer programmer in 1979. They employ about 6,000 employees, including 1,200 software staff. The campus is about 1.6 square kilometers in Wisconsin, which is in the middle of the U.S., and their company motto is do good, have fun, make money. Pretty interesting focus, those three: do good, have fun, make money. I have to say, as far as I can tell, they follow through on that motto extremely thoroughly. Epic's campus is in the middle of what used to be a bunch of cornfields in Wisconsin, 1.6 square kilometers of cornfields. And the joke there was that the founders toured sites in Silicon Valley and asked them how much space they needed for campus, and they accidentally added a 0 to the amount of land that they needed. And so they ended up buying 10 times as much land as they had been told they really needed. But it's in Wisconsin, and it was farmland, and so the land wasn't really that expensive, and so they ended up having an enormous amount of land. This is what the campus looks like today. They refer to it as the Intergalactic Headquarters. You can see they have some kind of traditional looking office buildings. This doesn't look too different from some of the Microsoft campuses in the Seattle area here. This could have looked like, a little bit like Red West 20 years ago. Here's another view. It has a nice little scenic river running through it, some nice buildings. They actually have a sign that says Epic Intergalactic Headquarters. That's not just a joke, or if it is, it's a well-documented joke, because they actually have a sign that says that. So they have some very nice focuses. They have a focus on learning and professional development. This is an aerial view of their learning center. As you can see, really nice building, and actually really big building. When you talk about a campus learning center, there's a lot of capacity for holding training and other kinds of learnings in a building that size. So clearly a commitment to that on the part of the company. They have some pretty interesting features. They have this auditorium. This is actually a picture of their old auditorium. They have a company policy that says they need to have a meeting facility big enough to have everyone in the company in the same room at the same time. And so this was the older auditorium that wasn't quite big enough to hold the current size staff. When I talked to Epic, I was down on the stage you see there, and the dressing room that I was in to get ready for my talk had the name Joan Jett on the door of the dressing room, because she had been there before, as the last person there before I was. And we had a pretty good turnout. I think maybe not as good for my talk as for Joan Jett, but anyway, very, very nice facility. And I think very interesting that they actually want to have a room that everyone in the company can sit in at the same time, and they have pretty regular meetings there. So remember this, their campus is on old cornfields, or on a cornfield. So they actually have taken inspiration from that. This is one of their newer office buildings. This is not a renovated barn that used to be there on the cornfield. This is a very high-tech, newly constructed workspace that they simply constructed to match what they thought was kind of the historical use of the land. I thought that was pretty cool. So you can see the more modern-looking techie building behind it on the left, but they've got this new building that looks like a barn on the front. And they've used this kind of architectural approach of very eclectic, distinctive architecture throughout the space. Now, also remember that this open land is in Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, in the winter, it gets cold. It gets very cold, and it stays cold for a long time. And so they have this large campus, and part of the feature of the campus is they have underground hallways that connect everything. So you never have to go outdoors in the winter. You can just walk underground, and the hallways are incredibly elaborate. So this is one example of a hallway where we've got a lighted ceiling. It kind of feels like we're out in space somewhere. This is another example of a hallway where it's been made to look like Grand Central Station and the New York City subway system. This is another example of a hallway which has been made to look maybe more like some kind of a dungeon or medieval scheme. And this kind of really over-the-top, elaborate construction is just spread throughout the campus. They have other kinds of corridors, like this one on the left is called the Stairway to Heaven, and then they've got the elevator that goes down to hell. As you can see, the decorations are extensive. The elevators are all distinctive. These are 3 different elevators that, as you can see, are quite distinctively decorated. Each conference room has a theme and is extensively decorated. This one is made to look like a log cabin. Here's one that looks like, I don't know what this looks like, South Beach or something. This one has been made to look maybe a little bit more like a barn or a farmhouse. You can see at the far end of this conference room there's a fireplace. Because they're cold, it's Wisconsin, every conference room has an actual fireplace with a capability of having an actual fire in it. It's kind of an interesting feature. They have really interesting conference rooms. They have these treehouse conference rooms, and these are booked pretty much 100% of the time because they're so cool. You get to walk across a drawbridge to your conference room, and you can hold executive retreats or brainstorming retreats or creative retreats, design reviews, that kind of thing. Now, for kind of obvious reasons, as we go through the facilities, Epic is regarded as the premier employer in its area. Every technical staff member has a title of developer. And so they really have tried to kind of democratize development. They're not differentiating on the basis of title. New employees come on board and they spend 4 months in training and orientation. And each employee spends 8 days per year shadowing customers. I think that's amazing. I would say that having developers having contact with real customers, I would say is a best practice that probably doesn't get described as much as it should. But I think that's a fantastic discipline on the part of the company. And as with Microsoft early stage and Google, the company provides meals, clothing, social opportunities to such a degree that in its area it's been accused of being a cult. I think in general, people start accusing companies of being cults when they are so successful and so desirable to work at that people just want to work there. So I think that's a pretty strong commonality with Microsoft and Google, but in a different geographic area. They have an interesting story, which is that they have a company policy of not providing perks to their customers. They don't take them to lavish dinners. They don't give them lavish giveaways. What they do say is, we are not going to give you a bunch of expensive gifts. What we are going to do is overwhelm you with the quality of our product and service. And I think that that is a really interesting perspective. Do good, have fun, make money. And the do good part of that says, we're not going to try to buy your business through the back door. We're going to buy your business through the front door by overwhelming you with the quality of our product and service. And I think that's pretty interesting. So Epic, the coolest company you've never heard of. Another company that's a little bit less flamboyant maybe is MDA. This is a company in Canada that I visited initially 20 years ago. And this company is interesting because the way I came to know them was I was doing a one-day workshop for them. And before I went in to do the workshop, I had asked, is there anything in particular you'd like me to focus on during the workshop? And it was kind of a general management technique workshop. And they said, yeah, the thing that would really help us is if you could help us get a handle on our software estimation issues. We're having a real problem delivering on time and on budget. And so as the workshop unfolded, I thought, okay, well, usually it's requirements issues and they have a lot of instability in requirements and that undermines predictability. We talked about that, and they actually had really well-defined requirements definition process. They had a process for accepting changes and evaluating change impacts. Bearing in mind, this was pre-Agile 20 years ago. So the requirements weren't really the issue. So I thought, well, maybe it's quality. A lot of companies have issues with out-of-control quality problems where they will build a lot of defects into the software and they'll think they're on track, but later in the project they'll start discovering defects and then the wheels will come off. That wasn't the issue at all. They actually had really rigorous quality practices where they were making sure that each step of the way everything was built to the highest possible level of quality, and they were actually tracking the escape rates of defects from one phase to the next. And they had pretty rigorous statistical process control over the whole thing, so it certainly wasn't a quality issue. So I thought, well, maybe it's poor planning and management. That's a common issue as well. And a lot of times companies just take technical staff and, quote, promote them into management. But that wasn't the issue at all. They actually carefully selected the managers. They put them through a lot of management training. They had a mentoring program, so it wasn't poor management. Finally got toward the end of the day, and I was puzzled. I couldn't figure out why a company that was doing so many things well would be having such terrible estimation problems. In fact, as far as I could tell, this was one of the best run technical organizations I'd ever seen. So finally I said, I don't understand why you guys aren't doing better than you are. Just how bad are your estimation problems anyway? And they said, well, maybe we're being a little hard on ourselves because we do deliver 97% of our projects on time and on budget with intended functionality, but we just can't seem to crack that last 3%. And so at that point, I had to kind of take a step back and say, do you guys realize how good that is? 97% is about the best I've ever heard in terms of on time, on budget, with intended feature set delivery. And in fact, they didn't realize how good they were. They thought 100% was the only possible sensible goal, and they weren't there. And so they were pretty self-critical about being only at 97%. And in the years since then, I have come to identify what I think is a pattern, which is I think a lot of the highest performing organizations also tend to be the most self-critical and in fact don't realize how good they are. And the opposite is also true. A lot of the worst organizations are the least self-critical, they're very complacent, they're very convinced that they're a lot better than they are. And so I think this was a pretty inspiring example. So these guys actually had a really interesting culture, very strong engineering culture, and good staff retention and pretty insane focus on quality and a lot of the other attributes we've already talked about. I think this brings us to a natural point to talk about taking a step back and looking at world-class organizations from another perspective. And one of the ways I like to look at this is through something called discipline of market leaders. And what the discipline of market leaders, this is based on a book that came out, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago maybe. They said that companies tend to emphasize one of three value dimensions. There are companies that emphasize operations, being predictable, efficient, and essentially, operating like a well-oiled machine. And those are companies that focus on operations. There are other companies that focus on product leadership or technical innovation. These are the companies who are known for having the latest and coolest leading-edge products. And then there are companies that focus on customer intimacy. That is, companies that really know their customers inside out, and their products might not be the coolest technology, they might not have the most efficient development practices, but they really meet the needs of their customers incredibly well. And the discipline of market leaders says that leading companies are going to satisfy in two of the areas and excel in only one of the areas. And their point is that you can't excel in all three areas. You're only going to excel in one and satisfy in the other two. So I think it's interesting if you're thinking, well, is my company a world-class software organization, to ask yourself, which of the value dimensions do you really excel in? Is your company's focus to excel in operations or product leadership or innovation or customer intimacy? And that ends up dictating a lot of what else your company does in terms of its software practices. Epic, I think, is an interesting one, with having their developers shadowing customers for 8 days a year. Customer intimacy seems like the one that I would probably pick for them. Microsoft in 1990, I actually would pick product leadership. I think, internally the company was very focused on doing the most innovative, coolest technology. We've worked with other companies, MDA. I think really I would say operations. They're really trying to fine tune that well-oiled machine as much as possible. So I think it's interesting to ask yourself, what does your company excel in and what do you only suffice in? All right, so let's continue our sample of world-class software organizations. The next one I want to talk about is the NASA Software Engineering Lab. This was a high-flying, if you'll pardon the pun, high-flying, well-publicized, effective software organization around 2000. and they were the first organization to win the IEEE's award for software process achievement. They're an incredibly process-oriented organization, doing all kinds of stuff to optimize their software processes. And I think it's interesting. They publish a list of top do's and don'ts, and for an incredibly process-oriented, quantitatively oriented organization, they have some interesting things on their list of do's. Empower project personnel. This is not about statistical process control. This is a very touchy-feely kind of consideration. Minimize bureaucracy. For an organization that had incredibly well-defined processes, the idea of minimizing bureaucracy is an interesting point. Foster a team spirit. Something else that doesn't have anything to do with quantitative management practices, but very much on that human touchy-feely side of things. And then start each project with a small senior staff. Another point that is very humanly oriented, maybe not what you'd expect from a really process-oriented organization. Boeing, I guess as long as we're kind of in the aerospace space, I think is another interesting organization. Boeing has had some hits and some misses, but I think one of the big hits was on the 777 project, where they had a 5-year schedule for the project, and about 18 months into the project, they identified that they were going to be overrunning by a little bit, and so they increased their testing staff slightly and trimmed about 5% of the functionality, and ended up delivering their software at the end of that 5-year period on time, on budget, at a life-critical level of quality, and they delivered about 5 million lines of code for that over the course of that project. And sometimes people might say, well, geez, yeah, if you identify shortfalls 18 months into a 5-year schedule, of course you're going to correct and deliver on time. But industry experience says otherwise. Industry experience says the average project in that scenario is not going to admit it has any problems until 4.5 years into the 5-year schedule, and then they're going to overrun by 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years beyond that. And so I think this is actually a really good story where they identify the need for corrective action early, they take meaningful corrective action, and they deliver on time. Boeing I bring up as an example because they have an ethos similar to what Microsoft has with that phrase, do the right thing, which is this phrase that I heard when I was at Boeing during the time I was working there that says, if you can't find the time to do it right, where are you going to find the time to do it over? It basically means the same thing that do the right thing means, which is we've got to keep quality first and foremost. And if we don't focus on quality first and foremost, then what else are we doing? So I think it's an interesting example from that point of view. The last organization I want to focus on in today's talk is Symantec. Maybe a little bit lower profile organization than some of the organizations that we've looked at, but I think it's interesting because they have such highly refined practices that work well for them. One of the things that they have as a concept is what they call UFOs, which stands for Uncommitted Features of Opportunity. And each developer has their work that they've been assigned to. If they finish their work early, then the reward for finishing the work early is that they get to work on a UFO, or uncommitted feature of opportunity. So these are features that haven't been promised to anyone, but that would be cool if they could actually be delivered. And so developers get to work on these UFOs, and there's some organizational cachet that goes along with actually delivering one of the UFOs. And so if you're a developer who has been able to deliver multiple UFOs to the customer, you have higher standing in the organization. Would that work in every organization? Maybe not, but it's a very interesting and distinctive aspect, I think, of Symantec culture. They have one of the most disciplined approaches to adding features to a planned product release that I've seen, which is, I think we've only worked with a couple organizations over the years that say when sales and marketing comes in and wants to add a feature, of course that has impact on the overall schedule and budget and so on, or maybe pushes other features off the list. But at Symantec, every time sales and marketing adds a feature, they have to sign up for an increase in the sales projections or sales quotas to go along with that. And I like that discipline. That's kind of a balance that we don't really see in most of the organizations that we work with. They have a promotion standard that says that part of how technical staff gets promoted is through accumulating a portfolio of product wins. And that phrasing is pretty deliberate. Portfolio of product wins. It's not technical wins. It's not saying, oh, the project was a technical success but a business failure. No, this is the opposite. It's product wins, products that actually won in the marketplace. And in essence, they're saying, we're not exactly sure what it takes to get a winning product into the marketplace, but if we see a person who's consistently been associated on the technical effort with something that's successful in the marketplace, we think we want more of that, and we're going to promote that person so that they can have a higher level of influence. And Symantec was described to me by a senior leader at Symantec as a world-class seat-of-the-pants organization. And I really like that phrasing, a world-class seat-of-the-pants organization. What they meant was, we're not using practices that are defined in anybody else's playbook, but we're using practices that really work well for us. We have figured out through seat-of-the-pants, through what works for us. We look at what works, we look at what doesn't work, and we keep doing the stuff that works for us. And I thought, it's very self-deprecating to say we're a world-class seat-of-the-pants organization, but at the same time, I think the substance of that statement is pretty important. That is, we're adapting practices for our particular needs and having those work quite well. Well, with that as a review of some world-class organizations, let's try to sum up. Are there any commonalities that we can find among this pretty varied set of examples? I think yes, the answer is we can actually find some attributes in common. I think throughout there is a focus on top talent. Who you're going to be able to attract is different. If you're high-flying Microsoft in 1990, high-flying Google 10 years later, high-flying Netflix or Facebook or Spotify today, your ability to attract top talent is really, really good. If you're an organization like NASA, you're going to have a different ability to attract top talent. But there's some things you can do if you're NASA that you can't do if you're Microsoft. NASA, you can say, we're going to send a space probe to Mars, and you get to work on that. That's pretty cool. So they can attract top talent as well. And then providing a pretty extensive level of support for that top talent. Some of that just reinforces the message that we attracted you as top talent, and now we're going to treat you as the top talent that you are. I think a strong sense of mission is common across these organizations. If you're in an organization like NASA and you're saying we're going to put people into space, it's pretty easy to get a strong sense of mission about that. I think it's actually in some ways a more impressive accomplishment for an organization like Google or Microsoft to achieve a strong sense of mission where you say, hey, we're going to work on version 17 of the next generation word processor. That's not as inherently motivating as sending somebody into space, at least I don't think so. And yet these organizations are able to achieve a high sense of mission regardless, and I think that's a good accomplishment. There's real business accountability. Microsoft's focus on shipping software exactly on time, the Ship It Awards, Symantec's focus on a portfolio of product wins. I think that's common across the leading organizations. Commitment to quality, variously defined. The quality, if you're NASA sending a human into space, is really not the same as if you're Google returning search results. I mean, people care about their search results, but it really doesn't matter as much as making sure that somebody stays alive on their space trip. So quality, variously defined, appropriate to the needs of the organization. Frequent introspection, I think, whether you're MDA saying 97% isn't good enough, or whether you're Symantec saying we're a world-class seat-of-the-pants organization, I think the introspection and maybe also being a little bit self-critical is also a commonality across world-class organizations. I think standard practices becoming highly adapted to the local environment. Symantec, I think, is the best example of that, where they've got practices that are unique to them. But I think that's one thing that we found in our work with companies at Construx is that the better a company gets, the more individualized their practices become. Companies that aren't doing that well are actually pretty easy to work with because we can work with them and help them kind of get on the rails and working smoothly. But for the companies at the very top end of the spectrum, they tend to already be very introspective and so and have really well-defined, highly locally adapted practices. And then I think we see finally a very high degree of energy and staff commitment, but really importantly, not as a cause, but as an effect of doing good work in all these other areas. And I think companies that try to copy the high-flying companies like the Spotifys and the Googles and the Microsofts 30 years ago often will confuse cause and effect. And they'll think if we can get people to work a lot of overtime, we'll be like these other companies. And that really misses the point. The people are working the overtime because they're motivated, they're bought in, they're committed, and they want to be there. Nobody's actually asking them to work the overtime. The overtime is the effect. And if you're doing all this other stuff right, then a lot of times you'll have a company where people want to work those long hours, but you're not going to get that by asking for it. You're going to get it by setting up the circumstances that make people want to do that on their own. And so with that, I think we've got a little bit of time to look at questions. And just a couple of minutes here, so I'm going to look at the chat for a minute and see what kind of questions we've got. So let's see. We've got one person who says, I was once told to only hand out a row of staples at a time. I told management what the hourly cost was and got that rule revoked. Very funny. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that comment. That's pretty extreme. Here's another one. My company has gone to all open work bays under the idea that they enhance communication. What have you seen as better, open work days or bays or cubes or private offices? Yeah, good question. I think especially for whatever reason, open work bays has been associated with agile development. I don't necessarily see those as being really going together all that well. I think in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of pretty public backlash against open work bays. Article titles like, the worst management idea of history as open work bays. The research that I'm familiar with is mostly from quite a long time ago that found that programmers were most productive in private or semi-private offices, where semi-private means two people. Certainly from going around and working with lots of different companies, when we see open work bays, we normally see workarounds for the open work bays. All the companies we visit think that they're the only company where people put on headphones as a sign of, don't bug me, I'm concentrating. But we see headphones as a pretty universal practice. We actually have worked with companies that provide a budget for people to buy headphones. And of course, a lot of people don't actually turn on their headphones. They just wear them as a sign that I'm concentrating. So, please leave me alone while I'm concentrating. We've seen companies that have like open work bays, but they have concentration areas. They're like phone booth size private offices that people can go in on a temporary basis. We see those kinds of rooms used a lot in the companies that have open work bays. Lots and lots of people gravitate toward those rooms where they can work without interruption. So I would say pretty clearly open work bays are the worst, generally speaking. Cubes are in the middle, and semi-private or private offices are the best. And I think, but if you can't have semi-private or private offices, making sure you provide space where people can go and concentrate, is pretty important. And then as a distant fallback plan, headphones, we see those all the time. I probably don't even have to mention it because they're so common. But yeah, I think, and then I guess the other point I would say is, different people are different. So the fact that one person likes an open work bay and somebody else likes a private office, you could easily put together a team of people who actually all really prefer being in an open work bay. So I guess one guideline I would have is just ask people, ask your staff, what do you prefer? And most companies are pretty limited by facilities, or most teams are pretty limited by their facilities policies. But if you're in a position where you're planning out a new work environment or a new building or something like that, I think asking people, what do you prefer, is good practice. And then I'd be surprised if you don't find a pretty high percentage of people who at least want the opportunity a lot of the time to go into some kind of a concentration room, even if they can't have a private office or semi-private office per se. All right, let's see what else we got here. Let's see. Yeah, so here's an interesting one. One of your first slides mentioned that a successful software organization delivers software on time, on budget, with intended functionality and with high quality. What if all the features you built on time do not solve the problems? What are your thoughts on how to measure value in the software being shipped? I think that's, that kind of goes back to my opening story about the software. It's a technical success, but a business failure. I think if you're developing a lot of features on time, but not solving the problem, you're probably over-optimizing. If you go back to the discipline of market leaders, you're probably over-optimizing for the efficiency, one of those three emphases, and not really sufficing on the customer intimacy or the innovation factor. So, it's an interesting one. I think that's a case of where there's this old management maxim of what gets measured gets done. You got to make sure you're measuring the right things. And if you're not measuring something that's important, you're risking not having that thing done at all. So in this case, I think, measuring customer satisfaction, measuring usage of the features. If you have features you're delivering that no one ever actually uses, making sure that that gets communicated. On time, all of the things being equal is really good and really important. On budget, all other things being equal is really good and really important. But if you're very quickly delivering the wrong thing, then that's not good for the business. So the business needs to make sure that it's actually measuring, that it's getting something useful, not just that it's getting something. And I think as long as that's happening, then that really shouldn't be that much of an issue. All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference.